There are many stories out there which are meant to spread joy, happiness, and all around good vibrations. In fact, they're the most popular kind of story. These stories are meant to inspire hope in the readers, make them feel good, and give them some sort of inspiration. They are also made to entice you to return week after week for new chapters to see if the main character gets what they want. However, sometimes there are stories which don't fit that description, stories which bring despair to the reader. Stories which make them want to stop reading, but it's so grasping that they can't seem to look away. That's the kind of story that Inyo Asano has created with Goodnight Punpun. Goodnight Punpun is a widely known manga series written and illustrated by Inyo Asano, whose previous works include What a Wonderful World and Solanin. It focuses on the life of Punpun Onodera, as we follow him from his childhood all the way to when he's in his mid-20s. However, when reading, you will realize there is something off about his appearance. One of the many ideas that Inyo Asano came up with was to draw Punpun as a cartoon-looking bird that looks like it was drawn by a child. The reason this decision was made was so that the reader could sympathize even more with the story, since the main character didn't have a definite name or face. For all we know, it could be the reader in that position. The choice was made since it only adds to the immersion of Goodnight Punpun. Punpun starts off as a very timid and quiet child. He doesn't have a good relationship with his mum, but he does have a good relationship with his dad. He is asked at a young age to write about what he wants to do in the future, and that's when we start to learn about the dream he has. He wants to explore space and have his own planet called Planet Punpun. His parents will live on it and they will be happy. He also really wants to watch some porn and happens to be in a club called the Porn Watchers Club. He wants to do so much, but that changes as the story goes on. Punpun goes through life feeling sad for himself, demotivated, angry, scared, and alone. He repeatedly closes himself away from the outside world since he is feeling sorry for himself. He doesn't experience life to the fullest and go out with his friends. He instead makes relationships just to end them by letting everyone down because he doesn't think he's good enough. He tends to blame himself even when it isn't his fault. This is something I think a lot of people can relate to. We all have times in our lives when we just feel like we can't do anything and we are clueless. But if Punpun shows anything, it shows that staying with that mindset and in that place will only cause you to spiral until it becomes too much. It goes into depth about many themes, for instance trauma, love, family, friends, dreams, and many more. What it tends to focus on a lot in the start of the story is family. Punpun lives with both his mother and father until he wakes up one morning to find his mother injured and his father standing in front of her. This leads to Punpun's uncle joining the main cast for a while, and while he has many issues himself, it tends to focus more on his relationship with Punpun and his mother. Not only does the incident introduce his uncle, but it is also the main point where Punpun's childhood trauma starts to build up. It shows how negatively it affects him in every detailed way, and shows how his traumatic upbringing ends up ruining his relationship and attitude towards people. Another theme that this story focuses on is love. The theme first appeared when Punpun has his childhood crush leave town, only to have love at first sight with a new girl named Aiko. They both develop a relationship together and make plans to run away to Kagoshima. However, Punpun doesn't keep his end of the promise and ends up leaving Aiko waiting. There's multiple time skips where we see Aiko and Punpun run into each other, but they never properly interact with one another. However, the whole time Punpun is still trying to move on from his love of Aiko, but he just can't seem to. Even when he is in a relationship with another woman, his feelings are still strong. It eventually gets to the point that when they meet up, Punpun tries to act like a completely different person, the kind that he thinks Aiko would like. This, however, doesn't work out since Aiko fell in love with the actual Punpun, not some fake one he is pretending to be. It's revealed that Aiko, like Punpun, has been waiting for their relationship to start up again, and when this is revealed, it becomes the start of their new relationship. The new relationship between Aiko and Punpun is very different than the old one, since it's not as innocent as before. See, Punpun, even though he put on an act at first, has actually changed massively as a person. He's no longer timid and keeping to himself. He's actually very forceful and open about how he feels. He realizes that Aiko isn't in a good position. She gets beat by her mother and verbally abused. However, instead of helping for her sake, he does it since it gives him an advantage. He ends up choking and beating her mother when she attacks both him and Aiko. He then patches up Aiko's stab wound that her mother gave her, forcing her to stay quiet. What follows next is him and Aiko taking her mother's body to a forest and burying it. They then decide to run away, but the place they decide to run away to is Kagoshima, the place where they originally planned to run away to all those years ago. Whilst they're running away to Kagoshima, they hijack the car which Aiko's mother owned, and end up at a shop. Whilst at the shop, Aiko decides to get a charm to write one of her wishes on. An issue with that is Punpun isn't in a good mood, so what he does is stop Aiko from writing it and drags her away. Later on, they end up at a gas station a few towns away. Whilst there, we see Aiko struggling in pain due to the stab wound that her mother gave her. But whilst that happens, Punpun goes away and beats someone because he feels like it. Once Aiko is feeling better, she ends up finding Punpun and begs him to stop, only for Punpun to try and make an excuse so he doesn't look bad. Inevitably, it doesn't work and him and Aiko drive off. Punpun doesn't want to be a bad guy, and so whenever he does something which is inherently bad, he comes up with an excuse to try to justify it. For instance, he constantly tells Aiko that he killed her mother to protect her. He's doing everything just to protect her. However, while saying this, Punpun knows full well what he's doing isn't right, but it doesn't stop him. He is constantly sexually and mentally abusing Aiko, and one day it gets to the point where they both physically abuse each other. One thing leads to another, and it gets so bad that Aiko ends up stabbing Punpun in his left eye, and another time she stabs him right above his heart. Punpun sometimes would punch her back, but that was all he would do. That is, until they went to the beach. This part is especially hard to read, since it's a lot of beautiful drawings of the beach view, with Aiko dancing around and having so much fun, but then it cuts to her sad expression as she asks Punpun, "Are you going to kill me?" Only for him to respond with, "Yes." He then proceeds to choke her with a rope as she screams she doesn't want to die, only for him to reply that he will be joining her. The drawings get more and more graphic until he gives up. After that, he doesn't try to do anything else. He just lies there next to her as he suggests that they should get married. They then just walk. They find a place and try to get jobs, but Aiko is labeled as a suspect when her mother's body is found by a hiker. They both know it's hopeless and that the only thing they can do now is walk. So once again, that's what they do. Punpun is then set on the idea of turning himself in so that Aiko can live her life free of the pain that she's going through. However, there was one problem with that. Aiko did not want to be left alone. The next thing to follow is Punpun waking up and seeing Aiko is missing. He gets up and sees a hat on the floor. He continues walking until he sees it. Aiko hanging there, lifeless. Punpun takes Aiko's body and just walks like before. He starts to talk to her and tells her about the plan he had for them, the life they were going to live. He eventually needs to rest, but when he does, some kids find him and he talks to them for a bit. But then he realizes he's left Aiko's bag behind and he doesn't want her to be upset, so he asks the children if they can watch her for him. He says she's sleeping and she just needs some rest, so they shouldn't wake her. But when Punpun returns, the body is gone. We never get a definite answer as to why Aiko hung herself, but the fans have all voiced their many opinions, with the most common one being that Aiko had been through too much. She didn't want Punpun to take the blame, she didn't want him to leave her alone, but she also couldn't carry on with the abusive relationship both her and Punpun had created. Now, after me rambling on about their new relationship and the events that happened because of it, you might be wondering, how is this about the theme of love? Well, the reason that this is the theme of love is because both Punpun and Aiko subconsciously both realize that they love one another. However, they don't love the versions of themselves now. They love the versions of themselves they both used to be. So since they both still had very strong love for the versions of them in the past, it made it hard for them to leave the ones in the present, causing this love-hate relationship that we see bloom into an abusive one. The thing that I think will impact readers the most is that if it wasn't for the trauma of Punpun changing him, or Aiko being in the terrible situation she was in with her mother, everything could have turned out different. They might have both been the same people that they both loved in the beginning, instead of being the ones who changed so much that they can barely recognize each other. So even though this isn't about the theme of love being happy like it usually is, it's about how sometimes love can be a negative thing. It can lead to very serious consequences and actions to the point where someone could take their own life. Goodnight Punpun goes into themes like this throughout the whole story. The only reason I decided to focus on this one the most is because it's the relationship that starts the story and the one that ultimately ends it. The series shows you Punpun's life and what he goes through to become the person he is, which created sympathy for him. But as I was reading the story, I started to dislike Punpun more and more. But at the same time, I understood why he was doing what he was doing. This conflicting mindset is what makes a story so grasping, as you know he's being a bad person and doing something that if anyone else was to do, then you'd want them to pay for it. It's Punpun. It's the child we've been watching grow up and change into the man we see abusing women and assaulting people. This conflicting mindset was one of the goals of Inyo Asano, since it makes the readers have to think about their actual opinion of Punpun and whether or not his actions can truly be justified. At the end of the story, Punpun has a dream. It's been a year since what happened with Aiko. He's older and he seems more mature. He's dreaming about Aiko, talking to her and telling her what's going on in his life. He tells her he's got a new job, his probation is done and he's doing well. He's finally moved on and it was easier than he thought. He says he's been living to help others and isn't doing actions out of greed or desire like he used to. He said he doesn't want to be remembered when he's gone. He has no dreams. He starts to talk about the past, specifically when they went out as children and saw the Milky Way, talking about if it was real or if they all just imagined it. He then starts to talk about how her voice is sounding faint and starts to question if that's how she really looked. He says even though it's only been a year, he's starting to forget her. He says he wanted Aiko to end his life. He said he's sorry for being a liar, and he says he won't be able to go see the Milky Way for her. As he is apologizing for everything he's done, it shows a piece of paper, the charm Aiko is writing on before Punpun dragged her away, and it reads, "I hope you never forget me." And with that, his alarm starts to go off and he says his final words to Aiko. "I'm sorry. Goodbye." This leaves the reader with the impression that he sees what he was doing wrong in his relationship with Aiko and feels responsible for everything that happened. Even though that doesn't excuse his actions or change what he's done, it at least leaves us with the thought that he's doing better and that he's on a path to be even a little bit as kind and happy of a person that the younger him wanted to be. I think that this is a very hard series to recommend to people, and that is why it is so good. Hear me out. This story has made me feel empty. It has made me question a lot of things in my life and question actions that I have taken. It has made me sad, happy, and everything in between, but I'm glad it did. Because at the end of the day, I have had the experience of reading one of the greatest stories to grace the world in recent times. The reason why it's so hard to recommend is because if someone is like me and doesn't necessarily enjoy reading grounded stories, then it will be hard for them to read. But if they when they finish it, they will be happy that they read it. I started reading Goodnight Punpun in November last year. I've been on and off with it since I've been buying the physical copies to read instead of digitally reading them because I prefer it that way. This meant I've been reading it at a slower pace than someone reading it online would. However, because of that, I think that the ending has hit me harder since it was a part of my life for basically 3 whole months. I think everyone should read this at some point in their lives. When people recommend manga, they usually recommend shonen or berserk. But there are many people who also recommend Goodnight Punpun, and that is for good reason, because I think that even though it might not help people out of a tough spot in their lives, it might actually make them sadder. In the end, it's a story of an entire childhood and early adulthood, which shows just how messed up life and people can be. So the people reading have a slight chance to realize that what they are going through is only temporary and they can make it out of it. Goodnight Punpun is easily a 10 out of 10, and there's no doubt about it. I will be recommending it to everyone I know, and I will make sure to do that until I vanish like an insignificant bubble. But why the hell did I have to read the words "a piece of brain just shot out of my wiener"? Like that didn't add to the story at all. It just made me feel uncomfortable.